"Take the water, child." The rancher's weathered hands trembled as he lifted the gourd, not from age, but from the sudden understanding that 200 pairs of eyes were watching from the mesa above, and his next choice would either save his family or seal their fate forever. Because sometimes the smallest act of mercy becomes the greatest test of who we truly are when no one is supposed to be watching. The first light of dawn painted the Texas desert in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the dusty ground where Samuel Hayes stood frozen at his cabin door, watching a small figure stumble through the sagebrush toward his well. The child moved with the desperate determination of someone whose body had pushed beyond its limits, each step a battle against the unforgiving desert that had claimed so many lives in this harsh land. Samuel's weathered hands gripped the doorframe as he studied the approaching figure, his mind racing through the stories that had reached their isolated homestead over the past months, tales of Apache raids that had left neighboring ranches burned and families scattered to the wind. Behind him, Martha's sharp intake of breath confirmed what his heart already knew, but his mind struggled to accept that this small child bore the unmistakable features and clothing of the Apache people, the same people whose warriors had been painting their faces for war and riding through these valleys like shadows seeking vengeance. The morning air hung thick with tension as Samuel felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket, knowing that his next actions would define not just this moment, but the very essence of who he claimed to be when tested by circumstances beyond his control. The child's lips appeared cracked and bleeding from thirst, a sight that pierced through Samuel's fear and spoke directly to something deeper than tribal boundaries or territorial disputes, something that recognized suffering as a universal language that transcended the artificial divisions men created to justify their hatred. Martha's nervous breathing behind him seemed to echo across the vast emptiness that surrounded their small homestead, a reminder that his choice would affect not just his own conscience, but the safety of the woman who had stood by him through drought and hardship, who had buried their own son in this red earth and still found the strength to build a life in this unforgiving wilderness. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a landscape that demanded respect and offered no mercy to those who failed to understand its brutal honesty. Yet in this moment it also offered something else, a stage upon which the true measure of a man's character could be revealed when no audience existed except his own soul and the watching sky above. Samuel Hayes, unremarkable rancher with calloused hands and a face carved by years of sun and wind, stood at the threshold between fear and compassion, between the easy path of self-preservation and the harder road of human decency, while a thirsty child approached his well and the morning shadows grew shorter with each passing second that demanded he choose who he would be when it mattered most. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now, let's continue. Samuel's rough hands trembled only slightly as he lifted the wooden gourd to the child's parched lips, his movements deliberate and gentle despite the thundering of his heart that seemed loud enough to echo across the desert floor. And in that moment of focused compassion, he caught the subtle shift of shadow against the red mesa cliffs above that made his blood turn to ice in his veins. There, painted in ochre and charcoal for war, stood the unmistakable silhouettes of Apache warriors, positioned along every ridge and outcropping, their presence so skillfully concealed that only his movement to help the child had revealed them, like spirits materializing from the very rock itself. To bear witness to this encounter that Samuel now understood was no random meeting, but a carefully orchestrated test of his character. The realization crashed over him like a wave of cold water that this small child was not a lost wanderer but likely the daughter or relative of a chief, sent deliberately to his well to measure the contents of his heart when faced with an enemy's vulnerability. Yet even as this understanding filled him with the kind of fear that could paralyze a man's limbs and steal his breath, Samuel continued to tip the gourd slowly, allowing the precious water to flow between the child's cracked lips while he whispered the few Apache words he had learned from traveling traders. "Drink slowly, little one," he murmured in halting Apache. His pronunciation rough, but his intent unmistakably kind, as the child's dark eyes looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and something else, perhaps surprise at hearing her own language, spoken with such gentle care from the lips of a white rancher. The desert wind picked up around them, carrying the familiar scent of sage and something else now. Something that seemed to whisper of danger and decision, of moments that could tip the balance between peace and bloodshed, depending on the choices made by ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Behind him, Samuel could hear Martha's sharp breathing through the cabin's open doorway, could sense her hands gripping the rifle they kept loaded for emergencies, her maternal instincts warring with her fear as she watched her husband extend mercy to a child whose people had been raiding settlements throughout this territory with increasing frequency and violence. The atmosphere had grown thick with tension that seemed to press down on them like the weight of storm clouds. Yet Samuel never wavered in his attention to the child, never allowed his newly discovered audience to change the fundamental nature of his response to human need, speaking softly in his broken Apache, while the water restored life to small lips and the warriors above maintained their silent vigil. Each second stretched like an eternity as the morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows that seemed to symbolize how quickly this moment of truth was approaching its inevitable conclusion. While Samuel Hayes, unremarkable rancher turned unwitting protagonist in a drama that would determine the fate of families across this harsh and beautiful land, continued to offer water and kindness to a thirsty child whose people watched from above to judge whether mercy still existed in the hearts of those they had learned to call enemies. The child drained the last drops from the gourd and lifted her head to meet Samuel's weathered gaze with eyes that held depths far beyond her tender years, dark pools that reflected not just gratitude, but an ancient wisdom that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. And when she spoke, it was not in the Apache tongue he expected, but in clear, precise English that rang across the desert air like a bell announcing the arrival of truth. "My father, Chief Running Bear, has been watching the white settlers for many moons, learning who among them possesses honor and who carries only hatred in their hearts," she said, her young voice carrying the weight of revelation that transformed everything Samuel thought he understood about this moment, this test, this carefully orchestrated encounter that had drawn him from his cabin at dawn to face the defining choice of his lifetime. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow as the full magnitude of what had just occurred crashed over him with the force of a flash flood, the understanding that this small child was not merely seeking water, but serving as an instrument of judgment, sent by her father to measure the character of the white rancher who lived at the edge of Apache territory and claimed to be different from the settlers who had driven the native people from their ancestral lands with bullets and broken promises. Samuel's knees nearly buckled as he realized that every moment of their interaction had been observed and evaluated by the war party positioned on the mesa above, that his decision to offer water and speak gentle words had been witnessed by warriors who had painted their faces for battle and could have swept down upon his homestead like a desert storm, leaving nothing but ash and memory in their wake. The desert heat began to shimmer around them now, creating waves of distortion that seemed to mirror the surreal nature of this revelation, as if the very air itself acknowledged that this moment balanced on the razor's edge between life and death, between peace and war, between the future his choice had created and the alternative timeline where fear might have triumphed over compassion. Martha's sharp gasp from the cabin doorway confirmed that she too had heard the child's words and understood their implications, that they stood at the center of a test that would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of every settler family within riding distance of Chief Running Bear's warriors, men who had suffered losses at the hands of white soldiers and civilians alike, and had every reason to seek revenge upon anyone who bore the color of their enemy's skin. The tension in the air grew so thick it seemed tangible, pressing down upon them like the weight of all the choices that had led to this moment, all the history of broken treaties and spilled blood that had brought them to this crossroads, where a simple act of human kindness might be the only thing standing between peace and a war that would consume innocent lives on both sides of the cultural divide that men had created. But mercy might yet bridge. Chief Running Bear emerged from the mesa's shadow like a figure carved from the red stone itself, his weathered face bearing the gravity of countless seasons and the weight of decisions that had shaped the destiny of his people, while behind him moved several warriors whose painted features spoke of preparation for battle, even as their weapons remained lowered, in a gesture that balanced readiness with restraint. The chief's approach was deliberate and measured, each step across the desert floor a statement of authority and purpose that commanded respect from both the watching sky above and the trembling rancher below, his dark eyes never leaving Samuel's face as he descended toward a meeting that would determine whether this dawn would be remembered for bloodshed or for something far more precious and rare. Samuel felt his hands shake with a fear that ran deeper than concern for his own mortality, yet he stepped forward rather than backward, placing his weathered body between the approaching warriors and the cabin where Martha waited with her rifle, his simple act of protection born not from foolish bravery, but from the same wellspring of human decency that had compelled him to offer water to a thirsty child, without counting the cost. The desert wind picked up around them, stirring red dust into spirals that danced between the two groups, like visible manifestations of the tension that could explode into violence or dissolve into understanding depending on the words that would soon be spoken, while the morning sun climbed higher and cast harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the stark contrast between these two representatives of cultures that had been locked in a cycle of mistrust and retaliation for far too long. When Chief Running Bear finally spoke, his English carried the precision of a man who had learned the enemy's language not from books but from necessity, each word chosen with the care of someone who understood that language could be either a bridge or a weapon, depending on how it was wielded in moments like this one. Many of your people have turned away thirsty Apache children, driven them from their wells with curses and threats, believing that cruelty toward the young would somehow protect their own families from our anger, the chief said, his voice carrying across the desert air with the authority of truth spoken without malice, but with the weight of experience that had tested his faith in human nature and found it wanting in all but the rarest of encounters. Yet you, Samuel Hayes, chose to see a child's need rather than a child's heritage, chose to offer water and gentle words when you could have chosen the easier path of hatred and fear that so many of your kind have walked before you, Running Bear continued, his words creating a moment of recognition that transcended the artificial boundaries men had drawn between themselves, acknowledging that in this vast and unforgiving landscape, where survival demanded both strength and wisdom, true character was revealed not through grand gestures but through simple choices made when no one was supposed to be watching, except the conscience that lived within every human heart. The silence between the two men stretched like the vast expanse of desert that surrounded them, heavy with unspoken understanding that seemed to draw them into a conversation neither had expected to have when this day began, and it was Samuel who broke that silence first, his voice rough with emotion that had been buried beneath months of stoic endurance since tragedy had visited his small family. "We buried our boy Thomas last winter when the fever took him," Samuel said, his weathered hands gesturing toward a small grave marker visible near the cabin. "And I reckon when you've held your child while life slipped away despite all your prayers and all your love, you start seeing every child as precious, no matter what language they speak or what color their skin might be. Because grief teaches you that pain is the same in every human heart." Chief Running Bear's stoic expression softened almost imperceptibly as these words reached him, and he nodded slowly before responding with his own burden of loss, his voice carrying the weight of a leader who had sent young men into battles from which they never returned. The white soldiers came to our village 3 seasons ago with their long guns and their promises of peace. But they brought death instead, taking my eldest son and 7 of our finest warriors with bullets and the poison they put in our water sources," the chief said, his dark eyes reflecting a pain that transcended cultural boundaries and spoke to the universal experience of fathers who had failed to protect those they loved most in this world. The desert wind swirled around them as they stood in this unexpected moment of shared vulnerability, stirring the red dust that seemed to rise and fall like the emotions both men had learned to suppress in order to lead and protect their respective families, while the harsh landscape around them bore witness to a conversation that revealed the common humanity beneath their opposing positions in a conflict neither had chosen but both had inherited from the actions of others. Samuel felt something shift inside his chest as he recognized in the Apache chief's weathered features the same expression he had seen in his own mirror during the darkest nights following Thomas's death. That look of a man carrying responsibility for others while wrestling with his own sense of failure and loss. "Every night I wonder if I should have done something different. Taken him to a doctor in town sooner, maybe found some medicine that could have saved him," Samuel continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "But I keep thinking Thomas would want me to help other children if I could, regardless of where they came from or who their parents might be." Chief Running Bear studied the rancher's face for a long moment before speaking again, his words revealing depths of character that few white men had ever been privileged to witness. "My son died calling my name, believing his father would somehow find a way to stop the bleeding, and since that day I have carried the weight of protecting not just my remaining children but all the children of our people, even when that protection requires me to paint my face for war and ride against settlements where innocent families might live alongside those who have brought us such grief and suffering." Despite Samuel's sharp gesture, warning her to stay inside where the rifle could protect her if this fragile piece shattered like glass in the desert wind, Martha Hayes stepped through the cabin doorway with the quiet determination of a woman whose maternal instincts had awakened something stronger than fear, carrying in her weathered hands a loaf of fresh bread, still warm from the morning baking, and a clay pitcher filled with cool water from their precious well. Her movements were deliberate but not defiant, respectful but not submissive, as she approached the group with the careful grace of someone who understood that her presence could either ease the tension that still crackled in the air around them or escalate it beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Yet she came anyway because she had seen the way Chief Running Bear's daughter looked at her father, with the same mixture of love and trust that her own Thomas had once shown, and that recognition had pierced through every barrier of fear and prejudice that months of terrifying stories might have built around her heart. The Apache warriors positioned around the homestead watched this unexpected development with expressions that shifted from suspicion to curiosity as Martha set the bread and water on the wooden table that Samuel used for outdoor work, then stepped back with a slight nod that conveyed respect without civility, her actions speaking a language that transcended words and cultural boundaries to communicate the universal gesture of hospitality that mothers everywhere understood as sacred duty. "Your daughter has traveled far and must be hungry as well as thirsty," Martha said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, addressing Chief Running Bear directly with the courtesy she would show any parent whose child had appeared at her door. "And I know that if my Thomas were lost somewhere in unfamiliar territory, I would hope some mother might offer him bread and comfort rather than turn him away into the wilderness." The chief's eyes moved from Martha to the simple feast she had prepared, then to his daughter who stood watching this exchange with the wide-eyed wonder of a child seeing adults choose kindness over the easier path of suspicion and hostility, and something in his weathered features began to soften as he recognized in this white woman's actions the same protective instincts that drove Apache mothers to fierce acts of love and sacrifice for their young. The tension that had hung over the homestead like storm clouds began to shift almost imperceptibly as the watching warriors observed this second generous act, this demonstration that compassion lived not only in Samuel's heart but also in the heart of his wife. proving that their earlier kindness had not been an isolated moment of weakness, but rather the natural expression of characters shaped by genuine human decency. The morning sun climbed higher in the vast Texas sky, casting shorter shadows that seemed to symbolize how the darkness of misunderstanding was slowly giving way to the clearer light of recognition, while Martha stood beside her husband with quiet dignity that proclaimed she would not be moved by fear from doing what her conscience told her was right, even when that choice required her to extend hospitality to people she had been taught to consider enemies. Chief Running Bear's next words fell across the desert silence like thunder rolling down from distant mountains, carrying a revelation that would forever change how Samuel Hayes understood the weight of simple human choices and their power to reshape the course of history itself. Before the sun rose this morning, my warriors and I had planned to ride against 3 ranches in this valley, settlements where we believed only hatred lived in the hearts of the white families who had taken our hunting grounds and driven away our people with threats and violence, the chief said, his voice carrying the gravity of decisions that could have painted the desert red with blood, and filled the air with the smoke of burning homes where children slept peacefully beside their parents. But your treatment of my daughter has shown me something I had almost stopped believing could exist among your people, something my own father told me to watch for, but which I had not seen in all my dealings with white settlers until this morning when you chose to see a thirsty child rather than an enemy warrior's offspring. Samuel felt his knees grow weak as the full magnitude of this revelation crashed over him like a flash flood, the understanding that his simple act of offering water and gentle words had somehow prevented a catastrophe that would have claimed the lives of innocent families, children who would never grow up to see another sunrise, parents who would never hold their young ones again, all because one man had chosen compassion over fear when tested by circumstances he could never have anticipated. Honor and mercy are the qualities my people respect above all others, more than skill with weapons or cleverness in battle, because we know that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy but from the courage to protect and nurture life even when that choice requires sacrifice and risk. Chief Running Bear continued, his dark eyes meeting Samuel's with an intensity that seemed to bridge not just the space between them, but also the vast cultural divide that had separated their peoples for generations of misunderstanding and conflict. The emotional impact of this moment seemed to ripple outward from where the 2 men stood, transforming the very air around them as Samuel realized that his willingness to help one small child had created a chain reaction of mercy that would spare dozens of lives, including his own precious Martha, who stood watching this exchange with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, understanding that they had been moments away from a tragedy that would have destroyed everything they had built together in this harsh but beautiful wilderness. I see now that you are not like the others who have driven away our children and poisoned our water sources. You are a man who understands that we are all fathers and mothers trying to protect our families in a world that seems determined to tear them apart, the chief said, extending his weathered hand towards Samuel in a gesture that transcended every boundary of race and culture and history that men had used to justify their hatred of one another. Samuel grasped that offered hand with fingers that trembled, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming recognition that he had found something he never expected to discover in this vast and lonely territory. A brotherhood forged not through shared blood or common heritage, but through the deeper bond of shared humanity that connected all people who chose love over hatred when tested by the crucible of difficult circumstances. As the Apache warriors began to gather themselves for departure, their painted faces now seeming less like masks of war and more like ceremonial expressions of a proud people who had found reason to hope that peace might still be possible in this troubled land, Chief Running Bear reached into a leather pouch that hung at his side and withdrew something that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat with recognition of its profound significance. The eagle feather that the chief held was not merely a decoration but a sacred symbol that carried the weight of generations, its golden-brown surface catching the morning light as Running Bear stepped forward and spoke words that would echo through Samuel's memory for the rest of his days on this earth. This feather has been blessed by our medicine man and carries the protection of the Great Spirit who watches over all children of the desert, both Apache and white, and I give it to you now as a sign that your family will be safe from any warrior who rides under my leadership," the chief said, placing the sacred token in Samuel's weathered hands with the solemnity of a man bestowing something more precious than gold or silver, or any treasure that could be measured in earthly terms. Samuel felt the weight of the feather and understood that he was receiving not just a symbol but a covenant, a promise that his willingness to see a child's need rather than tribal differences had earned him protection that would extend beyond his own lifetime and into the uncertain future where his children's children might need shelter from the storms of hatred that seemed to sweep across this territory with such destructive force. The chief then gestured to two of his warriors who approached the cabin with small pots of natural pigment, and before Samuel's amazed eyes they began to mark the wooden walls with symbols that would serve as a warning to any Apache war party that might ride through this valley in seasons to come, ancient signs that proclaimed this place and its inhabitants to be under the protection of Chief Running Bear and not to be molested by any who called themselves true followers of Apache honor and tradition. These marks will tell our people that here lives a man who chose mercy when he could have chosen fear, who offered water when he could have offered bullets, who saw the humanity in a child, even when that child belonged to people he had been taught to consider his enemies. The chief explained as his warriors completed their sacred work, transforming the humble ranch house into something that would stand as a testament to the power of simple human decency to overcome the artificial barriers that men created to justify their hatred of one another. Samuel accepted this honor with a humility that came from understanding how close he had come to failing this test, how easily he might have chosen differently if fear had triumphed over the better angels of his nature. And as he looked into Chief Running Bear's eyes, he saw reflected there the same recognition that both men had been changed by this encounter in ways that would resonate through all their remaining days. The desert wind picked up around them, carrying the familiar scent of sage but also something else now, something that might have been hope itself made manifest in the clear morning air. As former enemies prepared to part as friends who had discovered that the bonds of shared humanity were stronger than the divisions that circumstances and history had tried to impose upon their hearts. 3 days after Chief Running Bear and his warriors had ridden back into the mesa country from which they had emerged like spirits of the red stone itself, Samuel stood at his well drawing water for the evening chores, when he heard the approaching thunder of hoofbeats that no longer filled him with the paralyzing dread that had once gripped his heart at the sound of riders crossing the desert toward their isolated homestead. The dust cloud resolved into the familiar figures of neighbors from the scattered ranches that dotted this harsh territory, men whose weathered faces bore expressions of wonder and disbelief as they dismounted near Samuel's cabin and began to share news that seemed too remarkable to be believed, yet too consistent across multiple sources to be dismissed as mere wishful thinking or desert mirage. "Samuel, the raids have stopped completely," announced Jake Morrison, whose own ranch had been hit twice in the past year, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and amazement that seemed to echo across the desert floor, not just here but all through the valley. And word is spreading from settlement to settlement about a rancher who showed kindness to Chief Running Bear's daughter and somehow convinced the Apache to call off their war parties entirely. The other men nodded in agreement, their faces showing the kind of awe that men reserve for witnessing events that challenge everything they thought they understood about the nature of conflict and the possibilities for peace between peoples who had been locked in cycles of violence and retaliation for longer than most could remember. Samuel listened to these accounts with a humility born from understanding that he had been merely an instrument in something far greater than his own choices, that the simple act of offering water to a thirsty child had somehow become the first note in a symphony of peace that was now spreading across the entire territory, like ripples expanding outward from a stone dropped into still water. Behind him, Martha worked in the small garden plot where she had carefully planted the seeds that Chief Running Bear's daughter had pressed into her hands as a parting gift, tiny kernels of corn and beans that represented not just potential sustenance, but also the promise of new growth, emerging from the fertile ground of mutual understanding and respect that had been cultivated through their extraordinary encounter. The ranch itself felt transformed in ways that went beyond the visible Apache symbols that marked their cabin walls, as if the very air around their homestead had been blessed with a peace that seemed to radiate outward and touch everything within its influence, from the well that had become a symbol of life-giving generosity to the mesa cliffs where warriors had once waited to judge the contents of a white man's heart and found it worthy of their highest respect. Samuel watched the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon and reflected on how a single moment of choosing humanity over fear had reshaped not only his own destiny but the destinies of countless families across this vast and unforgiving landscape, children who would grow up without the shadow of war hanging over their dreams, parents who would sleep peacefully knowing that mercy had proven stronger than the forces that sought to divide human beings from one another based on the color of their skin or the language they spoke in their prayers. As the sun descended toward the western horizon, painting the red mesa cliffs in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to transform the very stone into something alive and breathing, Samuel Hayes stood beside the well where everything had changed and contemplated the profound truth that had emerged from his encounter with a thirsty child and the warriors who had watched from the shadows above. The same cliffs that had once concealed 200 Apache warriors painted for war now glowed with the peaceful light of evening, their imposing presence no longer a source of dread, but rather a reminder that true strength had never resided in the weapons men carried, or the walls they built to keep others away, but rather in the far more challenging courage required to see past surface differences and recognize the fundamental humanity that connected all people who drew breath beneath the same vast sky. Samuel's weathered hands rested on the wooden rim of the well as he reflected on how a simple choice to offer water rather than turn away in fear had revealed something that no amount of military strategy or defensive preparation could have accomplished. The understanding that peace was not the absence of conflict, but rather the presence of mutual recognition that every person, regardless of their heritage or appearance, possessed the same capacity for love, loss, hope, and the desire to protect those they held dear in their hearts. The evening wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain as Samuel turned toward you, the observer of this tale, his eyes holding the wisdom that comes only from having faced a moment when everything hung in the balance and choosing correctly despite the overwhelming pressure to choose otherwise. And in that turning, he posed the question that transforms every story from mere entertainment into a mirror that reflects the choices we all must make when tested by circumstances beyond our control. What would you have done in that moment when a small child stumbled toward your well with cracked lips and desperate eyes, when you knew that Apache raids had terrorized your neighbors for months and that offering help might mark you as either a fool or a saint, when you understood that watching eyes were measuring the contents of your character and finding either mercy or hatred, compassion or fear, the courage to see a fellow human being in need, or the easier path of turning away to preserve your own safety and comfort. Every single day presents us with smaller versions of this same choice, moments when we must decide whether to extend kindness to someone who looks different, speaks differently, worships differently, or comes from a place we have been taught to mistrust. And though these daily decisions may seem insignificant compared to the dramatic encounter between Samuel and Chief Running Bear's daughter, they carry the same power to either build bridges of understanding or reinforce the walls of division that keep us isolated from the very connections that might transform our communities and our world. The story comes full circle now to that dawn moment when a thirsty child approached and everything balanced on the edge of a blade, but the image has been transformed by understanding into something that challenges each of us to recognize that within our ordinary lives lie extraordinary opportunities to choose love over fear, compassion over suspicion, and the radical act of seeing others as fellow travelers on this difficult journey through a landscape that can be harsh and unforgiving, but also capable of supporting beautiful growth when tended with the careful attention that comes from recognizing our shared humanity